Welcome to my world history notes where I discuss things I'm learning about world history with you. Um, and it's not polished or professional, but it's just me just telling you about things that I'm learning and hoping that you'll be interested enough to dig into them and look them up, maybe even correct me or make your own comments and opinions about those things. We're talking about laying some groundwork for the Cold War. It's very important, and a lot of things that I thought I knew but didn't as I began to study. And this stuff is really interesting to me. I hope it'll encourage you to do some digging. So let's begin today. Have a few things to go over. So I'm going to talk about a Soviet agent, a prominent communist I want to bring up involved in our government in World War II, as we're in the last year of the war. And I want to start with a Soviet agent named Heed or Hedda Massing, born Hedwig Tune. This after the Second World War, she wrote for a German magazine. She was called by Richard Sorge, which was a Soviet spy. She was called him. She was called by him. She called him a near perfect spy. She had met him as a young communist in 1923, and she talked about a meeting they had in New York in 35. Now, she was she and her husband Paul Massing. Um, he was a rich American communist journalist, a publicist, and I'm sorry, her second husband. Her first husband was Gerhard Eisler. Her second husband was the rich American communist journalist, publisher, and sociologist Julian Gumpertz. Her third husband was a Marxist sociologist and Soviet spy Paul Massing. They were members of what's called the OGPU apparatus. They functioned under the direction of Boris Bassarov. Um, Massing was assigned several duties. She was a courier between the US and Europe. She also was an agent recruiter. She was very skillful at recruiting Americans to be Soviet agents. She used ideology. She preyed on strong anti-Nazi sentiments of New Deal liberals. Um, and in 1935, she argued, even met with Alger Hiss and talked about whether or not different people should be involved. So she supposedly left the Soviet intelligence apparatus in 1938 after a disillusionment with the Russian handlers, but in fact, it's known now that she and her husband continued to work for Soviet intelligence until Germany was defeated. So she was very active recruiter of spies. She also testified at the second trial. She got questioned eventually in 47. She testified at the second trial of Alger Hiss. Her cover name in the Venona transcripts was called Redhead. Uh, so anyway, she very interesting discuss, think about some of these spies that you just don't hear about. Now back to the timeline. If you remember when I talked about how the Russians used the Lend-Lease equipment to deal with the Japanese, um, back and forth to take our equipment that we gave them to deal with, to give to Japanese for exchange for equipment and purchase things. Well, if you recall the Levant crisis I talked about before, the British accused the French of using the equipment assigned to them to fight the Lebanese and Syrians in violation of their agreement with the U.S. Now, Europe, as the war ended, Europe was in chaos in many ways just after the war. Not every place was suffering, but many were in total disarray, as is understandable. It's important to note that on June 2nd, Pope Pius XII gave an address to the Sacred College of Cardinals warning that danger still existed in Europe, including those, quote, those mobs of dispossessed, disillusioned, disappointed, hopeless men who are going to swell the ranks of revolution and disorder in the pay of a tyranny no less despotic than those for whose overthrow men planned. Um, and in San Francisco, the Soviet delegation demanded a right of veto in the proposed United Nations Security Council. And as the war in Asia came to a close, there are two things I want to mention today. And then that's what we're going to talk about today. First, you have to understand we were fighting two hideously barbaric entities, Nazi Germany and Communist China. I'm sorry, Nazi Germany and Japan, Imperial Japan. The Japanese, Imperial Japanese, and Nazi Germany were incredibly brutal, incredibly sadistic, murderous thugs. Okay, they had to be stopped. But in the process, we allied ourselves. We had to. We allied ourselves with an equally brutal group of thugs called communists. Now, the communists in the Soviet Union and in China, the communists in the Soviet Union had already killed millions of their own people through forced starvation, through relocation, sending to gulags, just outright execution. It's just incredibly brutal what they did in their own country. The communist Chinese would do the same thing when they took over. And so I mentioned before that there's been reports that the communist Chinese did not try to fight the Japanese like the nationalist Chinese did. The communist Chinese Mao even stated what he was looking to do was to take over territory that was vacated when the nationalist Chinese who were fighting the Japanese would move. So the report is that the communist Chinese did not do a lot of fighting against the Japanese. Now, as the war and we came to a close in the East, two things are interesting here that I think. There was a missionary named John Birch. Now, he was a United States Army Air Force captain, military intelligence captain. He was an OSS agent in China during World War II. He was a Baptist minister and missionary. He trained at J. Frank Norris's school, and he helped the Doolittle raid flyers escape. He helped some of them escape when they landed or when they crashed in China back during the war. And an organization was named in his memory by Robert H.W. Welch in '58 called the John Birch Society, which was a very conservative, right-wing, anti-communist group. He was considered a martyr and the first casualty of the Cold War. Now, what happened? Why? Because he was at the end of the war. At the end of World War II, the OSS had ordered its people, its agents, to take the Japanese military surrender at their installations where they were, and then as he was the Japanese army was ordered to continue occupying the areas it controlled until they surrendered to the nationalist government, even in places where the Chinese-led government had been the de facto state for a decade. This led to continued fighting as Communist Chinese sought to expel all defeated Japanese imperial forces, which it perceived to include U.S. personnel who were openly collaborating with the remaining Japanese forces. That was the communist take. And then John Birch, what happened? He was ordered to take the surrender of Japanese commanders at their installations, and the Chinese communists, who were supposedly allies of the U.S., they weren't allowed to accept the surrender. And what happened? Communist Chinese executed him, killed him pretty brutally, as a matter of fact, as he was accompanying some surrendering Japanese soldiers. So anyway, John Birch is a notable figure, as the first martyr of the Cold War, according to right-wing sources in the U.S., and the John Birch Society was named after him. He's an interesting character to study, especially with his what he did during the Doolittle raid in helping those flyers. Now, another thing, the last thing I want to talk about is an interesting thing that I was really shocked about. You know, we read a lot about the role Americans and Russians in the Chinese Civil War that will come up in 45 to 49. But not much attention has been given to the fact that there were almost 4 million Japanese civilians and soldiers who were stationed in China at the time of Japan's surrender in August 1945. And many of them stayed on. Had a tremendous impact on future policy, Japan's policy toward Taiwan, and the way it affected Japan's relations with mainland China. So, for instance, in Shanghai, China's largest and most important city, the Chinese had ruled it for nearly 7 years. There really wasn't any evidence of a Japanese defeat. The city's administration was firmly in the hand of Japanese generals, and Japan's troops continued to patrol the streets, treated Chinese with their customary arrogance. The Japanese and much of the rest of occupied China, those in Shanghai, had no sense of having been defeated, least of all by Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime. On the contrary, most of them still had a lot of contempt for Chiang's armies. This was made obvious when Chiang finally sent a delegation of his generals to accept the Japanese surrender in Shanghai. The delegation was led by General Cheng Tongkuo, who played a role in the only major nationalist victory over the Japanese at Tere Chuang in 38, was one of the few genuine war heroes among Chiang's commanders. The plane that carried Chiang and his aides to Shanghai was operated by the American military, whom the Japanese regarded as their real conquerors. So this Chinese general was not met by the Japanese general commanding Shanghai, but by his deputy, and just a lot of disrespect. And so there was no hint. The point is that of these millions of Japanese that stayed behind, they participated in the Civil War on both sides. They had these were armies. They had armies that were capable of fighting and had not been defeated in China. They did not feel that they'd been defeated. Chiang tried to make use of defeated Japanese. Warlords tried to make use of defeated Japanese. They had skill, they had expertise. They weren't fighting them, but they tried to get them to fight their enemies, whether it's a warlord trying to maintain a situation, or whether they're using them against the communists, or the communists using them. So it's really, really pretty interesting how this turned out. Japanese soldiers, of course, the Russians attacked Manchuria, and that was another thing that was a disaster. But Japanese were still fighting. So the war, we think of World War II was over, but there was the Chinese Civil War that took place, and there were still Japanese fighting on the sides of nationalist and communist and individual warlords in this mess. So it's just something you don't think about. You don't think about the fact that there was a significant number of Japanese soldiers left behind in China who continued to fight for both sides in the Civil War. And you can read about that. There's a great article that I got this from by Donald G. Gillen and Charles Etter. It's called "Staying On: Japanese and Soldiers and Civilians in China, 1945 to 49." Okay, we'll stop there. But I do think that that's just something really interesting to me, because I never thought about that. You don't think about that. You think about the Japanese all going home and all that kind of stuff. So, all right, we'll continue next time, and I hope this will just encourage you to do some digging. Thank you.